Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of Rivals, of course in GT Sport as you saw from the title, and this is one which I kind of alluded to a couple of days ago when I was reviewing the BMW M4, because it's taken quite a while to get around to doing that car despite the fact that it was in the game from day one, primarily because it was already in GT6. For the most part we know what we're getting into with a car like that, so we were focusing on the newer stuff. Then, of course, more recently, we had the E92 M3 return, which was a fan favourite. A lot of people wanted that one brought back. And of course, the M3 is an established name. The M4 isn't, because it's never existed before in BMW, so it had much more to prove, but also a great lineage from the M3 to improve upon, possibly. And of course we'll find that out in a second. But for Rivals matches, if you've never seen a Rivals match before, what we do is we break down either car on its own first, like a mini review if you will, and then we compare their on-paper specs, generally speaking in their fully tuned form, and that is for a couple of reasons. One, because it's fun to see what the ultimate potential of a car is, but also because it shows what kind of range the car can give you, depending on which one you choose to buy. How many classes can you use it in, what kind of ultimate level of power or the lowest possible weight can you get out of it, that kind of stuff. So first of all, let's take a look at the newer of the two in terms of its game time, the M3. Well, the M3, as I alluded to just now, actually has far less to prove than the M4 does, because it's not a newcomer. It comes from an established, massively popular lineage of one of the most iconic and one of the most popular sports cars of all time, originating of course in the early 90s. Now, to give you some idea of how popular it is, the E92 was already one of the highest requested fan favourites to bring back to Gran Turismo, and now we have it back. The E36 and the E46 are both very highly requested. And of course the original E30 M3, which is my personal favourite, that was the #1 highest voted car by the community on GT Planet to be brought back to the game, and it finally was. So we're talking about a very, very popular lineup of cars, and even though they're not always the fastest on the grid, they are among the most popular, because in a similar way to stuff like the McLaren F1, the Pagani Zonda, various others, it doesn't necessarily matter if they're always the best. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. It's just because people love the car so much, the way it looks, the way it sounds, the way it drives, and of course being a BMW M car, the way it drives is an important factor. That's what BMW goes in for. It has to feel good. And that is the biggest thing that you notice as soon as you drive this M3. It feels great. It does weigh a lot more than the M4, which again I touched on in the review for that one, and incidentally, if you do want to hear far more in-depth discussions about both of these cars, you should probably check out my individual reviews for either of them. But for now, I would say that the biggest advantage that this M3 has over the M4 is probably the way it feels. It's so different, despite the two cars being so similar in so many ways. From the same brand, in fact, and arguably filling the same segment of the market, but the M3, to me at least, just feels like a more enjoyable experience to drive. So it's a very subjective one. That will not be the case for everyone, but it definitely is for me. The biggest disadvantage is undoubtedly the weight. It's a lot heavier. Stock, it's over 1,600 kilos compared to under 1,500 for the M4, and even fully tuned, it still weighs a lot more. It's well over 100 kilos heavier no matter what you do to it, stock or fully tuned. So that's my rough thoughts on the M3. What then about the car, which is a newcomer technically, but was actually in this game for longer? Well, that car is of course the M4. Now the M4 surpasses the M3 in so many ways. The biggest one that stands out on paper is the torque. It's not even close. Despite the fact that the M3 has a significantly larger capacity, a 4 litre compared to the 3 litre of this one, the turbo aspiration of this engine, the fact that it's completely overhauled compared to the technology that the M3 was using, the torque isn't even close. The M3's naturally aspirated V8 has less than 400 pound-feet. In fact, it has less than 300 pound-feet compared to over 400 for the M4, so it's not even close. The power is pretty close, but the torque is nowhere near. The weight advantage as well means that immediately, just on paper, without even turning the wheels in anger at all, the M4 has a lot going for it. It is more expensive though, and that's something to bear in mind. The M3 is under 100 grand, it's 93,000 compared to 120,000 for the M4. That's not necessarily always a disadvantage though, because funnily enough, you actually cannot use the M3, for instance, in Blue Moon Bay, which many of us do like to use cars like this for. You can't use that at all, whereas the M4 you can, so stuff like that is worth bearing in mind. As far as a track car though, well, you can see from the lap times, the M4 asserts itself pretty quickly. Now, in case you were wondering, these cars are not both fully tuned when it comes to the lap. I actually tuned them both to N400, so the weight is as low as it can go and the power is the highest that you can get it within N400, and that was the difference in lap time. Pretty significant. The M3 isn't slow, it's a 153.3, but the M4 did a 151.5. That's a lot quicker. For two cars in the same class, no less, that's a huge difference, especially on a track that isn't particularly long. If that was something like the Nordschleife, it would still be a significant difference, but here on such a short circuit, that's a huge difference. So, in terms of how they perform, it's not a wash for me. The M4 is quicker, but I still prefer the M3. Even though it's categorically not as quick under these circumstances at least. But what about the spec? What does each one offer in a more practical sense of what you can actually do with it? Well, as I mentioned just now, of course, the price immediately goes to the M3. 92,000 is simply cheaper, almost 30 grand cheaper. That's nothing to be sniffed at. As far as engine size, well, I've said this every time virtually, but it needs to be said again for those who haven't been in a Rivals match before. The bigger engine is not always the best. A Mazda 787B has a significantly smaller engine than something like a Jaguar XJR9, and yet it's just as good. Arguably better under some circumstances, so of course the bigger engine is not always best. However, we do give it the point purely because it's top trump style fun. So the 4 litre of the M3 is big enough to get it the point there on this occasion. As far as class, well, interestingly, despite the fact that the power and the torque go back and forth, they're actually equal. Both cars can go down to N300 and up to N600. Very interesting. Very interesting and pretty cool, because it means that if you do buy either of them, you're going to get the same amount of use out of it. They won't be as quick, but you can use them in the same classes, in career mode or online, if you want to. As far as power, it's interesting because when you fully tune them, the power is actually closer together than it is stock. That's a very interesting change, because stock, you're looking at what, like 415 horsepower from the M3, about 425 from the M4, whereas fully tuned, there's only 2 horsepower between them. They're both close to 600, so pretty healthy on both accounts there. So the point does of course go to the M4, but not bad for the M3. As far as torque, well, as I alluded to earlier on, it's not even close. The M4 has way more torque than the M3, and of course the M3 is not slow and it doesn't feel like it needs more torque, but the difference is massive. And the power is, well, the torque, I should say, is effortless in the M4. It coasts out of corners almost like you are doing just that, coasting rather than putting the power down. It's completely effortless. Whereas with the M3, I think kind of part of the fun and part of the charm is that it feels like the engine is working hard. That's why it's fun, in part. As far as the weight, well, again, the M4 easily runs away with that one. It weighs under 1,300 kilos, which, tuned or not, for a 2+2 luxury sports coupe, that's a very good level to be working at. 1,406 for the M3, that sounds more reasonable for a car of its type. And the horsepower per tonne does, of course, because it's more powerful and lighter, go to the M4. But doesn't sound too bad in comparison. 462 horsepower compared to 422 per tonne. That's not necessarily a massive difference, given how different the weight is between the two. But this is one of the relatively rare occasions in Rivals where the car that is faster around the track actually does also have more points, and that is, of course, the M4. Now, in one way, they both get a point, and that is the class range. The 2 points that the M3 has to its name are the price and the larger engine. So arguably only one of those is important, but of course going to the M4 is the power, the torque, the weight, and the horsepower per tonne. So it's pretty dominant on paper. It wipes the floor with the M3 when it comes to the spec sheet, but in practice, well, again, it wipes the floor with the M3. It's quicker as well. For me, despite all of that, I still prefer the M3 because I just think it looks better, feels better, and sounds better. But that's purely down to personal preference. Of course, it can go back and forth. If you're looking for the track weapon, go for the M4. If you're looking for fun, I definitely recommend trying out the M3. But that's it for this showdown. Of course, I'll see you next time. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.